everybody, welcome back to Life Under Deborah's Palm, where today we're going to look at the Bible. So first off, if you like this channel, please like, subscribe, share, comment, all those things. But as we talked about in the last video, if we're going to talk about God stuff, the book that talks about God and Jesus is the Bible. And so how do you know it's true? How was it written? How was it put together? What happened throughout history? So the Bible is actually a collection of books, and if you go back to, maybe if you took Spanish or French, the word was bibliothèque, which meant library, hello bug, which was a collection of books. And in the case of the Bible, there's 66 books written by about 40-ish authors over the course of 2,000 years. Now the 2,000 years was the time that they wrote it. It covers, I think, something like 3,500 years. I'm gonna have to check that. If I'm wrong, I'll put it on the screen. But there were about 1,000 years of oral tradition before things got written. That is a lot of information. So, like most cultures, there was an oral tradition, and then there came a point where writing and symbols and things like that, you know, cavemen wrote on walls or whatever, the symbols and the written language came along, and some of them were written on stone. The Ten Commandments said they were stone tablets. Not unusual. If you go back to your Egyptian history class, there was the Rosetta Stone, which was the key to hieroglyphics. There's also the Moabite stone. They've discovered all sorts of things. That clay, they also wrote on clay with some kind of metal stylus or wooden stylus, and eventually the scriptures went into paper, or probably papyrus, and maybe even animal skins. Throughout the Bible, you will see that God said multiple times, write things down. What I'm telling you, you need to write down. God was speaking to them and they wrote it down. So you can also look historically at kings and kingdoms. I'm gonna wait for this train to get going by. As I was saying, you can look historically at kings and kingdoms, and when they needed to get information across their kingdom, they wrote on scrolls, rolled them up or folded them, or usually they were rolled, gave them to a runner, and the runners went to the various cities and regions with the information. So those types of scrolls that were sent throughout a land were written multiple times because they had to go to multiple regions. So the exact same thing was written over and over and over and sent across an area. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew. Is the story of the Jewish people. That is the Jewish people call it the Tanakh, or the Tanakh. I guess I should learn how to pronounce that. And Christians just call it the Old Testament or the Old Covenant. These scriptures have been copied thousands of times. They have almost no discrepancies. There are some things that they do call textual variants, but the textual variants tend to be numeric. So, for example, there were discrepancies on how many years did King Saul reign, but the content was the same. No one knows exactly how the Old Testament was put together. There's no documentation or outline that a bunch of Hebrew scholars got together and this is how they did it and this is how they included books. And no doubt it was a long process that took place over hundreds of years, as it's covering approximately 3,500 years of history. So that had to be one long process. In the scriptures, there are mentions of books that no one's ever found. And in the book of Numbers, in fact, I have to read some of this. In the book of Numbers, chapter 21, verse 14, the book of the wars of the Lord is referenced, and yet no one ever found that. There was also a book called the Book of Jasher, which is 2 Samuel references it, as well as the Book of Joshua. I've seen now where people claim that they have written or found the Book of Jasher, but it's a very muddy thing, and I don't think anyone has really decided whether or not they are authentic scriptures. But there are things that were written about that never surfaced. So let's now move on to the New Testament, or the New Covenant. That is the part where Jesus shows up. It starts with the birth story of Jesus, goes through the first 4 books are the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then it moves into a lot of what was written by the Apostle Paul. And it's letters to the church, and it's history, and it's things written by the apostles. And those are a little bit easier, I think, historically to account for. Those writings were based on 5,800 manuscripts that had been collected. They were written, I believe it's pronounced Koine Greek, which was just common Greek. That was what they wrote in those days. Those were written, they take a guess, between about 35 AD and 95 AD is approximately when they think John wrote the final revelation. There are historical writings that go back to the 150s AD that state that the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were bound together and circulated throughout the church in that time, which was in like Israel, Mediterranean countries. I don't know how far it reached in 150 AD. Probably have to go research that somewhere. And also that all the letters of Paul and a few other books also were circulating that time, bound together. I don't know as there was an order to it. They were just bound together, and they were copied, and they circulated throughout the churches in those days. There are 27 books in the New Testament, and 19 of them were in circulation at that point. I know people are going to want to hop on here that do know a little history and say the Nicene Council in the 300s is where this got put together, but they're starting to find out that's not exactly historically true. So let's take a look at how we got from that, which is really a very brief history. People study this stuff forever. But let's jump from that to how do we get what we consider a modern Bible, or even just an English translation. So in the 1300s, there was a guy named John Wycliffe. He was an Englishman, and he began the translations. So in 1408, Parliament passed what was called the Constitutions of Oxford, which forbid anyone to translate the scriptures into English without what they called ecclesiastical authorities, which just meant the higher-ups in the church at that time. In those days, if the English people taught their children anything like the Lord's Prayer or the 10 Commandments in English, they were burned at the stake. So let's fast forward about 100 or so years, and we have another Englishman. His name's William Tyndale. He's a really smart guy, knows 7 languages, he's fluent in Hebrew, he's fluent in Greek. What 2 languages are the Bible written in? Hebrew, Greek, with a little Aramaic. He wants permission to translate into English after he starts chatting with priests and find out they can't read the scripture, they don't know what it says. He goes to a man named Bishop Tunstall, and he asks him for permission to translate. And the bishop says, no. Tyndale skips out. He goes over to Europe, where he ends up in Germany and a few other places, but mostly ends up in Germany, where Martin Luther had already come along in, 1516? Early 1500s, and put the 95 Thesis on the door of the Wittenberg Church. Go back to your history classes, assuming they still teach this, which started the Protestant Reformation. So that was going on already over there. So he went over there and translated it. It was perfectly legal. Then he turned around and he smuggled 6,000 copies back into England, where that bishop that told him no, he couldn't do it, chased the copies around and burned them. But he couldn't get them all. Eventually, Tyndale was caught. He was tried for heresy. In part, the heresy that he was tried for was much like Martin Luther, he believed in justification by faith, where the Catholic Church had been teaching the sale of indulgences in those days, and they found that to be heresy. He was strangled and burned at the stake. They say Tyndale's last prayer was that God would open the eyes of King Henry VIII. And 3 years later, King Henry VIII required all the parishes in England to offer an English copy to its parishioners. The printing press was around, it's been printed, King James and on up, you know, the language changes, but that's the basis for how we got to where we're at in a really short, condensed version. So is the Bible real and true and historically accurate and all those things, and is Jesus the Son of God? Well, those are things you're going to have to read for yourself, but I will read a couple of things that I find real interesting about what some people have said about the scriptures. And I have to read these. I got notes because I can't memorize all those quotes. But the first I really like, you know, first of all, historically, when I was in high school, I was taught that historically, no one debates the existence of Jesus. They know for a fact he existed. Whether or not you want to believe he's the Son of God who heals people and does all that, that's a different story, and that's a little bit what we're going to start looking at here. But I will read this. This was actually from a Jewish man. He is he's gone now. I think he did this mostly through the 50s and 60s. I'm not 100% positive. So I'm going to read this. His name was Dr. Nelson Glick. He was a Jewish man who spent over 40 years excavating Israel. The way he did this was he would open up the Bible, look through the scriptures, see where it said. There's a lot of, you know, they went here. It tells a lot of directions where they went, what villages they were in, what cities they were in. He used that as his guide. And they say he excavated 1,500 sites, and in that he found the sites of Edom, Ammon, and Moab, just to name a few. They're all biblical cities. He also found King Solomon's mines, M-I-N-E, like jewel mines or gold mines, that type of thing. This is his quote. This is really good. He said, "No archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or in exact detail historical statements in the Bible. And by the same token, proper evaluation of biblical descriptions has often led to amazing discoveries." So, historically, what is written is true. He found it where the Bible said it would be. So I'm not going to get way into this. I'm just going to give one example because I know there's always a lot of things like you can't be a scientist and believe in God. And yet, if you go back and look at Isaac Newton and James Joule and Kepler and all these guys, they were all Christians. So I'm going to give you one quote from a guy named Sir William Herschel, who, and I have to read his quote. He was an astronomer. He discovered how planetary moons. He discovered the planet Uranus. He also figured out there was infrared light in sunshine and studied and mapped the stars. He was an astronomer. And this is what he said. "All human discoveries seem to be made only for the purpose of confirming more and more truths contained in the sacred scriptures." Oh, if you go back and look at a lot of these guys, they will tell you the more that they studied, the more they figured out somebody had to have made something. And furthermore, the Bible actually does tell scientific things. And I'll just give one example. The prophet Isaiah wrote this in Isaiah 40, and he says, "He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth." Circle. The earth was round. Now understand, Isaiah lived in the 8th century BC. Nobody really knew. They probably were still arguing over flat, round, I don't know, dodecahedron, whatever. So historically, Pythagoras, remember Pythagoras? A squared plus B squared equals C squared? That dude, he came up with, I don't say came up with, he's credited with the theory that the earth is round. Isaiah already said it way ahead of him. Jump even farther forward, Aristotle is credited with figuring it out. They were proving what was already written in the scriptures. Modern day, this is one of my favorite quotes. There was a man named Chuck Colson, and if you're old enough, I don't know what they teach in school anymore. If you're not, there was something called the Watergate scandal in the 70s. As a little kid, I had no idea what it was. But what ended up happening was then President Nixon resigned over the Watergate scandals, and a guy that was part of his team was Chuck Colson. And they say Chuck Colson was ruthless. And I saw somebody talking about Watergate, and the guy said, if you ever said something like, hey, let's get a van and run this person over. Just kidding. You never said it in front of Chuck, because Chuck would go rent the van and run the person over. That's how bad Chuck was. Chuck Colson ended up going to prison for 7 months for the obstruction of justice, and while he was in prison, he met God. And I think he has a great quote in what happened to him. So he says the following: I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep a lie for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep a lie for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. And like I said, I don't think the hang-up is whether or not Jesus existed. I think the hang-up is it true? Is it real? You know, God lives in your heart. Things like that, they sound kind of weird, truthfully. So that's the part I think that people, was he the Son of God? What's a virgin birth? Does that really happen? You know, those things a lot of people aren't sure of, and that's okay. But ask yourself this question: how much of an impact did he make while he was here? He only lived about 33 years, and yet we started marking time. You know, everybody wants to change stuff, but it was BC was before Christ. AD was Anno Domini, I think is how you say it, and it means in the year of our Lord, which was after Jesus had come. We mark time by when this man was on the earth. Now, people started changing that. They didn't like it. It went to BCE, which was originally before the Christian era, which has now come to, I believe they now say it's before the Common Era. But that's not what it really was. Now we want to say ACE, after the Common Era. It is the marking of time by the life of Jesus. He made that much of an impact in the world. So obviously this is a really quick overview. You can study this stuff forever and get yourself caught up in it. And some people like to do that, really do like to go through and study. That's just in their nature. And if that's you, you should go check it out. But I will warn you, you're going to find, you know, the internet is full of everything. So instead of listening to a bunch of people who tell you Jesus was this or Jesus was that and he did this and blah, blah, and you've never read it, and you're making a decision on a book that you've never opened, you've never read. You have listened to people quote and misquote more times than you know. You are forming things and opinions of a book you never read. So when you listen to another person, where did they get their information from? And how do you know that was true? I mean, the Bible's the best-selling book ever. You can get it free online. So you haven't read any of it for yourself, and you're guessing other people are telling you the truth, and that may not be correct. And so before you tell me it's too hard to understand, no, it isn't. It's not. There are things you absolutely will not get and you will not understand. It's a lot of. But there are things that won't make sense, and sometimes it's a historical background. We aren't farmers, and a lot of things are written in an agricultural manner. There are things that you won't understand. There are things that will contradict what you believe. And I'm just going to tell you, when you come up against them, just let it go. Just let it go. It's okay. It's okay if it just, you know, things will come around when you need them to come around, and understand them when you need to understand them. The next time we're going to look at options for Bibles, I'm going to explain a little bit more how they're translated, just because no one ever explained any of it to me. And if you're going to look at something, don't you at least want to know how it was put together, and why the order of the books, and why is there an Old Testament, why is there a New Testament, what are all the annotations in the Bible? It's really not that hard, but if somebody gives you a quick overview, it makes things a whole lot easier. That's it. Have a great day.